Hello, I'm Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. We're continuing our study in the Gospel of Mark, and we are in Mark chapter 10, about halfway through the chapter, maybe a little more. And we keep seeing a pattern going on here that we've already seen from Mark chapter 9. Jesus talks about his sacrifice, his impending sacrifice, while the disciples fight for their own glory. Now, there's another prediction, the third one, that Jesus makes here concerning his impending death, and it's got more details in it than his previous ones. And although Jesus knows his fate, one of the things that this chapter tells us is that still he walked with purpose to Jerusalem, knowing what's going to happen to him there. So let's take a look at Mark chapter 10. We're going to begin in verse 32. It says, "They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking on ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. We'll stop there for a moment. So Jesus walks closer and closer to Jerusalem, and becomes increasingly important for his disciples to understand what's going to happen to him there, what the events that are about to unfold. And in a moment, we're going to look at how he reminds them of the events that are going to happen there that will ultimately lead to his death and then his resurrection. But he's got this sense of purpose, and it says that the disciples were amazed. Maybe it was this sense of purpose that amazed them. Jesus was certainly a man on a mission. He knew that every step he took toward Jerusalem brought him closer and closer and closer to that criminal's death that was waiting for him. But yet he walked confidently, purposefully, knowing that not even death would prevent him or prohibit him from fulfilling the will of his Father. There are lots of places, Isaiah the end of chapter 52 on through chapter 53, that reminds us of that, but also lots of places that tell us of Jesus' utter purpose. Hebrews chapter 12, the first few verses there remind us that in spite of what the grim events that he had to look forward to, he looked past that to the joy that would follow. And maybe that helps us also to see the reward of our own sacrifice, even as Jesus saw the rewards of his sacrifice. Notice with me, as Jesus begins to predict again for the third time his impending death, the end of verse 32 says, "And again he took the 12 aside and began to tell them that what was going to happen to him, saying, 'Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him, scourge him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise again.'" Now, of course, even saying this one time maybe would have brought alarm to anyone who would have heard it. This is not the second, it's the third time that Jesus talks about his impending death. And he adds, every time he talks about it, he adds amazing detail. Taken all together, this is what Jesus is talking about. He'll be betrayed to the Jewish leaders. He'll be condemned to death by those Jewish leaders. He'll be handed over to the Gentiles, the Romans. He'll be mocked, spat upon. He'll be scourged, which itself was sometimes punishment and torture enough to kill a man. But finally, he would be killed. And he adds the detail in Matthew's gospel, Matthew 20 in verse 19, specifically concerning how he would be killed, by crucifixion. But as he always does, he reminds them that would not be the end. He would rise again, we're told here, 3 days later in verse 34. Crucifixion was a terrible, brutal, shockingly violent way to die. It wasn't invented by the Romans, but they put it to good use. They used it for maximum torture, and they reserved it for the worst criminals ever. They wouldn't even crucify fellow Romans. They crucified those whom they thought were the worst of the worst. And it was used to good intent. It was somewhat a deterrent. But if crucifixion was regarded by such dread by the Romans because of the horrific death that it brought, it was also regarded that way by the Jews, but for a different reason. Deuteronomy 21 verse 23 tells us that anyone who hangs on a tree is cursed by God. And so the Jews would look at those who were being crucified as not only rejected by men, but ultimately rejected by God. They would be under God's curse. Now Jesus is talking about the fact that he's going to die. And if the Gentile, or rather if the disciples had any kind of martyrdom in mind, surely it must have been that Jesus would have gone out in some kind of blaze of glory, in some glorious death. But crucifixion? Certainly not by the horrific execution by crucifixion. And yet, Jesus says such is God's will. And all the humiliating treatment that goes along with it, the scourging, the mocking, the being spat upon, the rejection by man. Luke's gospel in chapter 18 verse 34 records for us some of the disciples' confusion about it. And it tells us that the understanding was hidden from them, not because Jesus didn't allow them to understand, but maybe because more so they were just reluctant to accept it. And that's brought all the more to the forefront by the request that a couple of disciples make. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 35, it says, James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory. But Jesus said to them, You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism which I am baptized? They said to him, We're able. And Jesus said to them, The cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, that is not mine to give, for it is for those for whom it has been prepared. Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. Calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, You know that those who were recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it's not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. We'll stop there for now. This section constitutes an episode in its own right. It serves to bring together a lot of the messages of preceding paragraphs in Matthew's gospel. It ties together a lot of things nicely that Matthew's gospel had already been talking about. But we've seen it here, the idea of heavenly rewards that Jesus talked about here in Matthew chapter 10. In verse 30, he says that the one who follows him, who leaves all for his sake and the gospel's sake, will receive rewards, not only here, but in the age to come. But they've got the wrong kind of reward in mind. They make this request to Jesus. And notice how they phrase it. They said, We want to sit with you in glory. Now, Matthew's gospel seems to indicate that it was the mother of James and John who had instigated this whole request, and that James and John join in the petition. Whether that's so or not doesn't really matter. The point is they were asking for it. And maybe the brothers were contemplating the thrones which Jesus refers to in Matthew 19, telling them that the disciples themselves will sit and judge the tribes of Israel. Of course, Jesus had a different kind of meaning than what they understood. But maybe that's what they're thinking about. And if it is, then they missed the spiritual application that Jesus intended, not only of that prophecy, but also the one just uttered moments earlier concerning Jesus' own death. Jesus responds to them, and he says in verses 38 through 40, basically, you don't know what you're asking. They're ignorant. And so Jesus basically says, you really don't know what you're asking. There's a cup that I'm going to drink. Are you going to be able to drink that? There's a baptism with which I'm going to be baptized into. Can you be baptized into that? Of course, they don't know what that's all about. Although the word cup was a common metaphor for suffering, and sometimes even for God pouring out his wrath upon individuals and on nations. The word baptism, sometimes we forget that it means immersion. There's an immersion, there's an overwhelming character to the suffering that Jesus was going to have to endure. And yet still they say that, yes, we're able. And in a way, they're right. They didn't know it, but they were right. James, we're told, was the first martyr in Acts chapter 12. He was killed by Herod, while John was the last. Although there were attempts made on his life, he was finally exiled to the island of Patmos, where, although he died of old age, he was persecuted for his part in propagating the gospel. But Jesus says, it's really not mine to give. It's the prerogative of the Father. He says in verse 40, to sit on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. It's not that Jesus didn't have the power or the authority to grant or to do whatever he wished. I think what Jesus is saying here is a reminder that nothing will be awarded except by the will and the purpose of the Father. That's what Jesus said he came to do. He came to do the will of his Father. That's the food that he said sustained him in John chapter 4 and in verse 34. But then we see some resentment develop. In verse 41, we see that the 10 are indignant against James and John. Maybe they're angry that James and John got the jump on them, and that maybe they are going to be granted something. And they're resentful of the fact that James and John were maybe quicker to mention it than they were. But it just shows us that these 10 have the same worldly yearnings that James and John did. They were looking for prestige and power, and the desire for that was in the 10, just as it was in the 2. So Jesus reasons with them by first reminding them of the greatness, or rather how greatness is viewed by Gentiles. He says over in verse 42, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. So those who don't know God, those who don't understand the need for humility and servitude, are looking for prestige, power, and position. And Jesus tells them that's what people who don't know God look for. But then he reminds them God has a different view of greatness. He says in verse 43, it is not this way among you. And of course the implication is because you're God's children. You know God, and you should know how God views greatness. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. And then he gives himself as that emphatic example. For not even the Son of Man came to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus' culminating statement helps us to understand how he drives home the point that ought to have made these disciples ashamed of the requests that they make. The disciple who seeks to dominate instead of minister, who seeks to rule instead of to serve, needs to read this and read it again and again carefully. Jesus makes sure we understand what his Father looks for as far as greatness in his kingdom. And we understand that by looking at Jesus. Well, Jesus continues, and Oh, this is going backwards. We'll move on. In Mark chapter 10, and in verse 46, it says, they came to Jericho. Now in Jericho, Jesus is going to heal a blind man. You recall back in Mark chapter 8, Jesus healed a blind man kind of in stages. He spat on his eye, makes some mud with them, and put it on this man's eyes. And when he opened them, he says, I see men like trees walking around. And then Jesus heals him further so that he can see clearly. Here he's going to do it all in one step. He's just going to heal this guy. And we had made the observation before that perhaps maybe Jesus had healed that man previously in Mark chapter 8 in stages, because of the fact that the disciples themselves were having a hard time seeing clearly. We see that they still are. Well, don't forget that when Jesus does something physical to heal someone, there's always a spiritual component to it. And blindness, of course, is what these disciples themselves are steeped in. But very soon, they will see very clearly. In verse 46, when we're told that they come to Jericho for the first time in a while, since they left Galilee back at the beginning of Mark chapter 10, Mark pinpoints where they're at. Before, he simply mentioned that they went over beyond the Jordan, to the east of the Jordan, to Perea. Now they've crossed back over, and they're in Jericho. Sometimes the Gospels talk about going down to Jericho, which regards its elevation. It's way down. In fact, if you saw just a few moments ago, in verse 32, it says they were on the road going up to Jerusalem. That speaks of elevation. There was an uphill climb to get to Jerusalem. Well, Jericho sits down at either sea level or below. In fact, it's about 1,200 feet below sea level. It's about 15 miles northeast of Jerusalem. It's got a rich history of being one of the oldest cities in the world. In fact, if you'll recall, it was the first great victory that Joshua led the children of Israel to when they first crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. While he is in Jericho, there is the cry of a blind man who wishes to be healed. Let's read this whole section here. Verse 46, they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. And when he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him here. So they called the blind man, saying to him, take courage, stand up, he's calling for you. And throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus. And answering him, Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? The blind man said to him, Rabboni, I want to regain my sight. Jesus said to him, go, your faith has made you well. And immediately he regained his sight and began following him on the road. We'll stop here for a moment. Notice the cry that this afflicted man cries out to Jesus. We've seen before that blindness in ancient times was so disabling to them that for those who were struck by it, all they really could do was sit somewhere and beg and depend on the kindness of other people. And it tells us here that not only is Bartimaeus blind, verse 46 says he's a blind beggar sitting by the side of the road. Of course, you would want to sit somewhere. If all you could do was beg, you would want to sit somewhere where people were passing by so that you could cry out for their generosity. And he does that. He cries out for generosity. When he hears that Jesus is crying out, notice how he regards him. Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. In Matthew's version, in Matthew 20 and verse 30, he throws in the word Lord. have mercy on me. But we see him say this twice. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Says it in verse 47. He says it again in verse 48. And there's a lot going on in this cry that Bartimaeus makes to Jesus. It encapsulates some understanding that blind Bart would have had. When he cries out, Jesus, Son of David, it encapsulates the understanding that the Messiah would certainly be David's son, that is, from his lineage, and therefore would be a legitimate heir to David's throne. But he also calls him Lord in Matthew's gospel. That is, that he would be the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one. But also, when he says, have mercy on me, he believes that Jesus would be able to do that, confer mercy on him. Now, I have no doubt that certainly Bartimaeus is looking for a physical mercy. He's looking for a deliverance from his blindness. But oftentimes, when people would cry to God for mercy in the Old Testament, they would cry to him for salvation, for deliverance from their enemies. And that's certainly the mercy that Jesus had come to provide for those who would call on him. So this blind man indicates in his cry an obvious belief of the messiahship of Jesus and his power to bless him somehow. But we see that the crowd offers their criticism. It says that they were sternly telling him to be quiet in verse 48, but he cried out all the more, it says, Son of David, have mercy on me. He's not about to be quieted. Now, we looked before in Matthew chapter 10 where some had brought children to Jesus to be blessed, and the disciples rebuked them, told them to go away. Of course, Jesus said, permit the children to come to me. Now, maybe if we're given benefits of the doubt, maybe we can say that those who told this man to be quiet were maybe doing so out of respect for Jesus. They didn't want the blind beggar to bother Jesus, or maybe that they thought his cries would annoy him. But although he's told to be quiet, he cries out all the more. He's unwilling to be quieted. Maybe he thought that this opportunity to somehow gain Jesus' attention would be his only opportunity. May not happen again. And Jesus listens. We see the compassion of the Christ in Jesus' attention to this man. Look with me again in verse 49. It says that Jesus stopped and said, call him here. Again, as always, Jesus provides for us this great example of humility and servitude. Remember what he said back in verse 45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Even as he is on his way to Jerusalem, to deliver himself to a hideous execution, still he stops to consider others, and he proves it again and again and again by his actions. So upon hearing that Jesus is calling for him, what does blind Bart do? Look at verse 50. He throws aside his cloak, he jumps up, and he comes to Jesus. Now we kind of rush by the idea that Bartimaeus throws aside his cloak. But let's just consider that for a moment. Bartimaeus is blind. He's a beggar. He's got nothing. And probably his cloak is the only thing that he's got, not only to cover himself, but to keep him warm at night. It may, in fact, be his only possession. But upon hearing that Jesus wants to see him, he throws it aside and makes his way. He jumps up in his eagerness and goes towards Jesus. And I love what happens here. In verse 51, Jesus asks him, what do you want me to do for you? You remember in our earlier episode with the disciples who were jockeying for position, he asks them in verse 36, what do you want me to do for you? Well, they wanted power, prestige, and position. I think Jesus has an idea of what Bartimaeus wants when Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? And notice the way that Bartimaeus addresses him. He says, Rabboni, I want to regain my sight. Now we could have called Jesus Rabbi, which means master or teacher. But Rabboni is a more exalted version of that. It means something like my great teacher, my great master. It's the most honorable master of all. Rabboni, he says. Matthew chapter 20, verse 34 inserts a little detail here that we've seen often, in fact, in Mark's gospel. Matthew 20, verse 34 says that Jesus was moved with compassion, and he touches the beggar's eyes. Well, immediately we see here that he regains his sight, and he began following Jesus. And Jesus tells him, go, your faith has made you well. Well, what faith was that? Was it the faith that Jesus could do it? I think it's deeper than that. I think it's the utter belief and trust in who Bartimaeus believed Jesus was. That he was Lord, Son of David, the Christ, who could provide mercy. And although he tells Bartimaeus to go, Bartimaeus comes. He follows Jesus, which again provides for us just the simple example that once blind and now having regained his sight, he follows Jesus. He could have gone his own way, but he doesn't. He follows Jesus. And that's important for us, I think. We who were once blinded by sin and have had our eyes opened could go our own way, but how much better is it to follow Jesus? He's no longer dependent on following somebody around, but he does. He's happy now to follow Jesus, and so should we be. And so Jesus continues, and in our next episode we'll see Jesus approaching Jerusalem for his final week. And although he enters triumphantly, by the end of the week, he will be condemned as a criminal and hung on a cross. But as Jesus kept reminding his disciples, that's not the whole story. He'll rise again. And just as he entered victoriously, he will leave victoriously. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate so much you being with us. Hope we'll see you again. God bless you.